When my husband dragged that 20-foot steel shell up the frozen trail in November of 1947, I stood at our cabin door and thought he'd finally lost his mind. The Quonset hut curved like the rib cage of some enormous metal beast, corrugated panels catching the weak Montana sun as Jonathan and two borrowed horses hauled it inch by inch through early snow. Every man at the trading post had told him it was madness. I'd heard them myself, standing in the corner with the other wives while they laughed about the war surplus junk he'd bought for $75. A storage shed, they said. Not fit for living. Certainly not fit for wrapping around a perfectly good cabin like some bizarre second skin. But standing there watching him work, I wasn't thinking about what the men had said. I was thinking about my mother. About the cabin in Colorado where she'd frozen to death when I was 12 while my father was in town buying supplies and I was at school learning multiplication tables. They found her 3 days later curled near a cold fireplace, frost on her eyelashes. The cabin had been solid spruce built by men who knew their craft. It hadn't mattered. Cold doesn't care about craftsmanship. I'd spent 20 years running from that memory. Running from isolation, from silence, from the kind of places where help is 8 miles away and winter can kill you before anyone knows you're dying. I'd built a life in Chicago teaching second graders in a warm brick schoolhouse, sleeping in a heated apartment where radiators clanked all night, and neighbors lived close enough to hear if you screamed. Then Jonathan came home from Normandy with something broken behind his eyes, and suddenly we were here in Montana, in another cabin, and he was building a metal shell around it that looked exactly like the kind of desperate thing a man does right before everything falls apart. The morning he left for Great Falls to buy that Quonset hut, I'd sold my mother's sapphire ring, the one thing I had left of her. He didn't know. I got $42 from a jeweler in Kalispell and hid it in a coffee tin under the floorboards because when men make choices this big, this strange, someone needs to have money for the aftermath. For the train tickets back to civilization when winter proves them wrong. For the coffins, if it comes to that. But I didn't leave. I watched him build. And now looking back from where I stand today, I can tell you that the metal shell wasn't madness. It was salvation. By the time that winter released its grip, our cabin would hold 55 degrees more warmth than our neighbors' homes, using a fraction of the firewood, and Jonathan's impossible design would spread across 3 states. But in November of 1947, I didn't know any of that. I just knew my husband believed in something, and I had to choose whether to believe in him. The story really begins in Chicago in the spring of 1945, when Jonathan came home from the war. I'd been teaching at Lincoln Elementary for 6 years, living in a 3rd-floor walk-up with good light and a landlady who made soup on Sundays. My life had the pleasant predictability of city routines. The 7:15 streetcar, the smell of chalk dust and children's paste, the Friday teachers' meetings where we complained about parents and compared lesson plans. I dated a banker named Robert for 2 years. He had steady hands and talked about down payments and pension plans. I was 29. It felt like enough. Then Jonathan showed up at my classroom door on a Tuesday in April, still wearing his uniform, looking like he'd walked straight from the train station without sleeping. We'd known each other in high school back in Wisconsin before my family moved to Chicago. He'd been quiet then, good at mathematics, the kind of boy who built things in his father's workshop while other boys played baseball. I'd tutored him in English, once helped him write an essay about Walden Pond. We'd kissed twice, fumbling in earnest before I moved away and life pulled us in different directions. Now he stood in my doorway, thinner than I remembered, with crow's feet around his eyes that hadn't been there before, and a way of flinching at sudden sounds that made my stomach tighten. The children had gone home. Spring sun slanted through the tall windows. "I need to ask you something," he said, not sitting down, just standing there with his hands in his pockets. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it much recently. "I can't breathe in this city, Kate. All these buildings, all these people. I wake up and the walls are too close and I can't breathe." I set down my lesson book. The chalk dust motes hung suspended in the light between us. I bought land in Montana, 160 acres, pine and stone and a creek that runs all year. I'm going to build something there, something simple, something clean. He looked at me, then really looked, and I saw how much it cost him to ask. "Come with me, please." The banker Robert had just that week suggested we look at engagement rings. He'd shown me a catalog, pointed to a modest diamond, talked about a June wedding, and a house in Oak Park near his parents. I could see that life clearly. Safe, warm, surrounded by people and streetcars and hospitals 3 blocks away. But Jonathan's eyes held something that made my careful life feel like hiding. I said yes. I broke things off with Robert, gave notice at the school, packed 2 trunks with books and winter clothes and my mother's few belongings. My friends thought I was insane. My landlady cried and said Montana was where people went to die or disappear, and what was the difference? In June, Jonathan and I married at City Hall with 2 strangers as witnesses, then took the train west. I told myself I was being brave, that I was choosing love over safety, adventure over routine. But late at night in our sleeping car, watching Jonathan jerk awake from dreams he wouldn't talk about, I wondered if I was just running toward a different kind of death than my mother's. Maybe this time it would be slower. Maybe this time I'd see it coming. Montana territory hit me like a physical blow. The space of it. The silence. We arrived in Kalispell on a July morning with everything we owned in 4 crates and took a wagon the final 8 miles to Jonathan's land. The valley spread out between mountain ranges, pine forests thick as walls and sky so big it made my chest hurt. Our nearest neighbor was Gary Young, a homesteader 2 miles south with a wife named Laura and twin boys who were 7. The trading post was 8 miles north. The doctor was in Kalispell. In winter, I learned later that 8 miles might as well be 800. Jonathan started building the cabin the day we arrived. He worked like a man possessed up before dawn, swinging an axe until dark, barely stopping to eat the meals I cooked over a camp stove, while our daughters Rebecca was 7, Nicole 5 from Jonathan's brief first marriage that ended when his wife died in childbirth, played in the dirt and asked when we'd have a real house. He cut spruce logs 12 inches thick, fitted them with hands that knew exactly what they were doing. He dug a foundation, hauled fieldstone, built a chimney that drew clean. The cabin rose through July and August, solid and tight, with a steep roof for snow shed and proper corner notching that would keep the wind out. He barely spoke during those months, just built. I'd catch him sometimes standing with a log half hoisted, staring at nothing, and I knew he was back in France seeing things I couldn't imagine. At night he'd wake gasping and I'd hold him while he shook, and in the morning he'd go back to building without mentioning it. The cabin was good work, careful work. By September we had walls and a roof and a door that latched solid. It should have felt like victory. The first night we slept inside, I lay on our mattress listening to the silence and thought about my mother. About how she'd probably felt safe too, right up until she wasn't. Rebecca asked me once while we were unpacking kitchen things why we'd left Chicago. She remembered the apartment, the noise, the other children. Nicole was too young to remember much, but Rebecca had that way of watching adults that meant she understood more than she said. Because your father needs space to heal, I told her, which was true but incomplete. The whole truth was that I needed to believe I could be brave enough to save him from whatever haunted him, and brave enough to save my daughters from inheriting my fear. The autumn was beautiful. Golden aspen against dark pine air so clear it hurt to breathe. Jonathan seemed easier once the cabin was finished, like he'd proved something to himself. We gathered firewood, stacked it against the north wall, prepared as best we could. Gary Young stopped by in October with Laura, and the boys brought us a side of venison and told us what to expect from winter. He'd been homesteading for 5 years. His cabin was similar to ours, maybe a little smaller, built from the same valley pine. "It gets cold," Gary said, watching Jonathan stack wood. "Real cold. You'll want 4 cords minimum to make it through. More if the winter's hard." Jonathan nodded. "We've got 6 cords cut." Gary glanced at the cabin, at the tight log work at the chimney. "Looks good. Solid. Should keep you warm enough." Laura took my hand before they left. Her fingers were rough from work, her face weathered but kind. "You'll be all right, Katherine. First winter's the hardest, but you learn. We're close if you need anything." I held on to that promise later when close turned out to mean absolutely nothing against Montana winter. The cold arrived in November like an invading army. The first night it dropped below 0, I woke to Rebecca coughing. Not a normal cough, but the deep wheezing cough that meant her asthma was flaring. She'd had it since she was 4, mild enough in Chicago with its humid air and nearby doctors, but out here in the dry cold it grabbed her lungs like a fist. I sat up, found the lamp, lit it with shaking hands. Rebecca sat hunched in her blankets, fighting for breath, her face pale in the lamplight. Nicole slept on curled tight under quilts. Jonathan was already moving, adding wood to the fire, stoking it higher. The thermometer on the wall read 43 degrees. Outside was 12 below zero. A difference of 55 degrees, and still our daughter couldn't breathe. I held Rebecca, felt her ribs heave, whispered the things mothers whisper when they can't actually fix anything. Jonathan fed the fire until it roared. The cabin warmed to maybe 47 degrees. Rebecca's breathing eased slightly. By dawn, she could sleep. That was just the first night. December brought cold that redefined the word. -20, -30 nights when the logs themselves seemed to contract and crack, when frost formed on the interior walls in lace patterns that would have been beautiful if they weren't terrifying. I stuffed rags in every gap I could find. Jonathan fed the firebox every 3 hours day and night, burning through our carefully stacked wood at a rate that would see us out by February if we were lucky. The cabin stayed between 42 and 48 degrees when we were burning constantly. It dropped to freezing within an hour if the fire went out. Rebecca and Nicole slept in their coats. I slept in mine. We gathered around the stove for meals for everything, because anywhere more than 5 feet from the fire was unbearable. I watched our wood supply shrink and did math in my head that wouldn't come out right no matter how I calculated it. Jonathan stopped sleeping. He'd doze for an hour, wake to feed the fire doze again. His eyes grew hollow. The cabin we'd thought was solid, that had looked so tight and well-built in autumn sun, bled heat like it was made of paper. Wind found seams we'd never seen. Cold radiated through those 12-inch logs as if they were nothing. One night in January, I sat with Rebecca during a bad attack, her breath coming in short gasps, and I thought about my mother, about how she must have felt alone and cold, knowing she was dying. I thought about the coffee tin under the floorboards with $42 in it, enough for train tickets to Chicago if I could get us to Kalispell alive. Jonathan came to sit beside me. His hands were cracked and bleeding from hauling wood. He didn't say anything, just put his arm around me while I held our daughter. "This was a mistake," I said. I kept my voice low so the girls wouldn't hear. "We should never have come here." He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice cracked. "I'm sorry, Kate. I thought I built it right. I thought I could keep you safe." That was the night I hated him. Not for bringing us here, but for being broken in a way I couldn't fix, for needing something I couldn't give, for putting our daughters in danger because he couldn't breathe in a city where hospitals were 3 blocks away and we'd all be warm. I hated him. And I hated myself for following him. And I hated Montana for being exactly as deadly as I'd always known wild places were. He left the cabin, just stood and walked out into the 20 below night without his coat. I almost went after him, but Rebecca needed me, and I was so tired of choosing between impossible things. He was gone for 2 hours. When he came back, his face was red from cold and tears, though they'd frozen on his cheeks. He didn't speak, just sat at the table and started drawing. By morning, he had pages of sketches, diagrams with measurements and notes, cross-sections showing 2 walls with space between them, calculations about airflow and heat transfer. His hands shook as he drew, but the drawings themselves were precise, almost obsessive. "What is that?" I asked. "A way to fix this." January crawled past. Rebecca's asthma eased slightly, or maybe I just got better at managing it. Or maybe we all just adapted to constant low-grade misery. Jonathan spent every moment he wasn't feeding the fire or hauling wood working on his designs. He explained it to me one evening, speaking with an intensity I hadn't heard since before the war. In Normandy, we built double-wall bunkers. Inner wall for living space, outer wall for protection from shelling. The dead airspace between them absorbed blast impact better than solid concrete. He spread the drawings on the table. "Wind is the enemy here, Kate. Like mortars were there. It strips heat directly off the cabin walls through convection. but if I put a second wall around the cabin, leave an air gap, the wind never touches the cabin itself. I looked at the drawings. They made a certain kind of sense, the way things do when you're desperate enough to believe anything. You want to build a wall around our cabin. Not a wall, a shell, metal, something that blocks wind completely. He tapped one of the sketches. The Army Depot in Great Falls has surplus Quonset huts, 20 feet wide, 48 feet long, designed to shelter equipment in the Aleutian Islands. If I mount one over the cabin with a 2-foot air gap, the metal takes the wind. The air gap becomes insulation. Still, air is the best natural insulator there is. This sounds insane, Jonathan. His jaw tightened. Maybe it is. But what we're doing now isn't working. Rebecca almost died last week. You know it. I know it. We can't survive another winter like this. How much does a Quonset hut cost? $75. I thought about the sapphire ring already sold, about the $42 hidden under the floorboards that were supposed to be our escape money, about my mother dying in a well-built cabin because well-built wasn't enough. We can't afford it. I'll make it work. He met my eyes and I saw something there I hadn't seen since before he left for France. Not fear, not that broken thing that woke him at night, but determination. I need to try, Kate. I need to know I did everything I could. What if it doesn't work? Then at least I'll know I tried. That was when I understood. This wasn't really about the cabin. It was about Jonathan needing to prove he could still protect something, could still build, instead of just surviving. The war had taken that from him. Montana had reinforced the lesson. This metal shell, this desperate, strange plan was his way of fighting back. I thought about saying no, about taking the girls and leaving while the weather was still passable, about using that hidden money for train tickets instead of watching my husband waste our last dollars on war surplus. I could picture it. Me and the girls in Chicago in a warm apartment safe. Jonathan here alone in his cabin feeding a fire that would never keep him warm enough, proving nothing to no one. Or I could believe in him. Could choose trust over fear. Could bet our lives that his broken mind could still engineer something whole. I'm scared, I said. Me too. But I believe you when you say you can fix this. Something in his face eased. He pulled me close and I felt him shaking, not from cold, from relief. We stood there in our freezing cabin while our daughters slept in their coats, and I wondered if faith was just another word for the kind of foolishness that gets people killed. But I'd already sold my mother's ring, already chosen this path. Might as well walk it all the way to whatever end was waiting. Spring came late and left early. By April, Jonathan was planning in earnest, calculating measurements, pricing materials. In May, he took the wagon to Great Falls, a 3-day trip, and came back with a Quonset hut in sections. The curved steel ribs, the corrugated panels, the bolts and brackets. $75 worth of war surplus that looked like junk spread across our yard. Gary Young rode over when he saw Jonathan unloading, stared at the metal pieces like they were evidence of insanity. What in God's name is that for Jonathan? Weather protection. Gary walked around the pile, frowning. You building a barn? Something like that? He left, shaking his head. I watched from the cabin window, holding the last of the coffee tin money. $23. Enough for emergency supplies if this all went wrong. Not enough for train tickets anymore. We were committed. Jonathan worked through June and July building the frame that would support the Quonset shell. Heavy timber posts every 6 feet around the cabin perimeter extended out 2 feet. Cross braces overhead. He was meticulous, checking every measurement twice, building something that would hold the metal ribs steady against Montana wind. I helped when I could, holding posts while he drove them, fetching tools, keeping the girls occupied. Nicole asked why we were building a second house around our house. Rebecca, older, more observant, asked if we were hiding from something. From the wind, I told her. Your father is building us protection from the wind. Will it work? I don't know, baby. But he believes it will. And sometimes belief is enough. Rebecca looked at me with those 2 old eyes. Do you believe it, Mama? I'm learning how. The work was brutal. Jonathan lifted metal ribs that weighed more than he did, bolted them to the timber frame, fitted the corrugated panels with his cracked hands. I saw him falter, Sometimes saw him sit down suddenly and put his head in his hands, and I knew the war was back, the memories, the sounds. But he'd sit there for a minute breathing hard, then stand and go back to work. One evening in late July, I found him collapsed beside the half-built shell, not unconscious, just lying there in the dirt staring at the sky, too exhausted to move. I sat down beside him. "We can stop," I said. "We don't have to do this." "Yes, we do." "Why? Why does it have to be this? Why can't it be enough that we tried? Because trying isn't the same as protecting." He turned his head to look at me. "I couldn't protect my men in France, Kate. I couldn't protect my first wife. Every time I close my eyes, I see people I failed to save. This cabin, this metal shell, maybe it's crazy. But it's the first thing since the war that feels like I might actually be able to keep someone safe. I can't stop. I need this to work." I lay down beside him in the dirt. The Montana sky spread above us, endless and indifferent. "What if it doesn't work, Jonathan? What if we freeze anyway?" "Then we freeze. But I'll know I fought." That's when I told him about my mother, about finding her frozen, about the 20 years I'd spent running from empty places and silence and the kind of cold that kills, about how terrified I was that history would repeat itself, that I'd lose my daughters the way my mother lost me. He didn't say it would be okay, didn't promise we'd survive, just took my hand and held it, two broken people lying in the dirt beside a half-built metal shell that might save us or might be the monument to our combined foolishness. We got up, went back to work. By October, the Quonset shell was complete. Steel ribs arched over the cabin like a rib cage, panels bolted tight with careful overlap. Jonathan had cut ventilation gaps near the foundation and at the ridge small enough to prevent drafts large enough to let moisture escape. He'd built an airlock entry with double doors to minimize heat loss when coming and going. The chimney penetrated both structures through a collar he'd fashioned from scrap metal and packed with mineral wool for fire safety. Standing back to look at it, the thing was undeniably strange. The cabin roof sat shadowed beneath the steel arch. The whole structure looked like a barn had swallowed a house, or like we'd wrapped our home in the hull of some beached metal ship. The air gap formed a dim corridor all around the cabin, 2 feet of space that smelled of new steel and old pine and tasted like gamble. The trading post had been talking about it for months. I'd heard the whispers during my visits, seen the looks. Stephen Taylor, who owned the sawmill and had built half the cabins in the valley, made sure I overheard him tell another customer that Jonathan Wright was either a coward or a fool, probably both hiding his cabin like a man ashamed of his own work. Laura Clark. "My one friend defended us once, said we deserved a chance. The other women went quiet the way people do when they know you're wrong, but are too polite to say so." In early November, Stephen rode out to see for himself. He circled the structure twice on his horse, shaking his head like he was viewing a disaster site. Jonathan was adjusting a vent baffle when Stephen spoke. "This looks like you're ashamed of your own house, right? You hiding from something or just from winter?" Jonathan didn't look up. "Just trying something different, Stephen." "Different?" Stephen snorted. "That metal is going to condense every bit of moisture in the air. You'll have ice on the inside of that shell by Christmas, dripping down, rotting your logs from the outside in. I've seen it with steel sheds. This is worse. You've trapped your whole house in a sweat box. The vents handle it. 6 little holes fighting condensation from a whole cabin. That's not engineering right. That's wishful thinking." Stephen left. Word spread faster. At the trading post, Laura told me later they'd started calling it the tin coffin. Someone said Jonathan had wasted good surplus on wrapping a perfectly good cabin in garbage. The jokes got meaner. I stopped going to town unless absolutely necessary. But it was Andrew who hurt the worst. Jonathan's brother showed up mid-November unannounced, driving his wagon down from Whitefish, where he'd built a successful carpentry business. Andrew Jackson Wright, master craftsman whose work won prizes at the county fair, whose cabins were considered the finest in the region. 3 years older than Jonathan, and everything Jonathan used to be before France broke him. He stood in our yard for 5 minutes without speaking, just looked at the metal shell with an expression I couldn't read, then turned to Jonathan with something that looked like pity. You know what this looks like, little brother? It looks like you don't trust your own work. Like the cabin you built isn't good enough, so you had to hide it. People are going to think you're either scared or incompetent. Maybe both. I'm not trying to impress anyone, Andrew. I'm trying to keep my family warm without burning 6 cords before March. There's warm and there's practical. This isn't practical, Jonathan. This is desperate. Andrew glanced at me, then back at his brother. I know you saw things in France that worked in extreme conditions, but this isn't France. We've been building cabins in Montana for 70 years. If this worked, someone would have tried it already. Maybe no one needed it badly enough. Or maybe it's a bad idea built by a man who can't see straight anymore. Andrew's voice softened, which somehow made it worse. You can't engineer your way out of trauma, little brother. That's not how healing works. I stepped forward then. Andrew, please leave. He looked at me, and I saw him measuring, calculating, judging whether to say what he was clearly thinking. When he spoke, he addressed me, not Jonathan. You deserve better than this, Kate. Better than a metal tomb in the middle of nowhere. Better than him. Get out, I said. My voice shook, but I meant it. Get out of our property. Andrew left without looking at his brother again. I heard his wagon creak away down the frozen trail. Jonathan stood there, shoulders tight, staring at the metal shell like it was the last thing tethering him to sanity. I walked to him, took his hand. He's wrong, I said. Jonathan's laugh was bitter. Is he, though? Look at this thing, Kate. Maybe they're all right. Maybe I am broken. Maybe this is just desperation wearing the mask of engineering. I turned him to face me. Listen to me, Jonathan Wright. I spent my whole life afraid. Afraid of cold. Afraid of isolation. Afraid of dying, like my mother died. I let that fear make my choices. I almost married a banker I didn't love because he was safe. But then you came back from the war broken and honest, and you asked me to believe in something besides fear. And I chose you. I chose this. Not because I wasn't scared, but because I was tired of letting fear be the strongest thing in me. I pulled him close. So, yes, you're broken. We all are. But you're turning your brokenness into protection. You're fighting, and I'd rather die fighting beside you than live safe without you. He held me so tight I could barely breathe. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet but clearer. What if I fail them, Kate? What if this doesn't work and Rebecca and Nicole suffer because I wouldn't do things the normal way? Then we fail together, as a family, the same way we'll succeed if this works. She rested her head against his chest. But I don't think you're going to fail. I think you understand something about heat loss that everyone else missed because they never had to survive the Aleutians. I think you're smarter than Andrew, than Stephen, than all of them. I just wish you believed it too. That night I found Jonathan's journal in the air gap corridor where he'd left it on a support post. I shouldn't have read it. But I was desperate to understand the man I'd tied my daughter's lives to. The entry from October read, "If this fails, I fail them. If this works, maybe I'm not broken after all. Maybe broken men can still build things that stand." I sat there in the dim corridor between cabin and shell, between warmth and cold, between faith and doubt, and cried. Not from fear this time, from understanding. He wasn't just building a weather shell. He was building proof that broken things could still protect what they loved. I closed the journal, left it where I'd found it, went back inside to where my daughters slept peacefully for the first time in months, because autumn was mild and we weren't cold yet, and they didn't know what was coming. The last weeks of November passed in strange suspension. Jonathan checked and rechecked every connection, every vent, every seal. I gathered what supplies I could afford, tried to prepare for what the winter might bring. Rebecca and Nicole explored the air gap corridor like it was a cave, their voices echoing off metal and wood. They were afraid of it at first, but children adapt to strangeness faster than adults. Eventually they played games there, hide and seek in the shadows. Nicole asked me one evening while I was cooking dinner why everyone laughed at Daddy. I knelt down to her level. Because they don't understand what he's built yet, baby. Sometimes people laugh at new ideas because they're scared of being wrong about old ideas. Will they stop laughing? I think so. But even if they don't, it doesn't matter. What matters is that we believe in each other. "Do you believe in Daddy, Mama?" I paused, thought about the truth, about the doubt, about the coffee tin money I'd never told Jonathan about my mother frozen in a well-built cabin and my fear that history was a wheel that just kept turning. "Yes," I said, "I believe in him." And I realized, saying it out loud to my daughter, that it was true. Somewhere between Chicago and Montana, between fear and faith, between my mother's death and my daughter's lives, I'd stopped just hoping and started believing. The first snow fell on November 28th, light flurries that caught in the steel corrugation and melted by afternoon. But it was coming. Winter. The real test. The thing that would prove Jonathan right or prove everyone else right. The thing that would save us or kill us with no middle ground. That night, after the girls were asleep, Jonathan and I stood in the cabin looking at the thermometer. 52 degrees with just a moderate fire. Outside was 28 degrees. A difference of 24 degrees with winter barely begun. "It's working," Jonathan said quietly. "Even now it's already working." I took his hand. "Don't celebrate yet. We haven't seen real cold." "I know. But Kate, even this, even just this much difference, it means something." I pulled him close, rested my head against his chest, listened to his heartbeat. The cabin settled around us with small creaks and sighs. Outside wind picked up, testing the metal shell, looking for weakness. It would find none, or it would tear the whole thing apart. We'd know soon enough. "Tomorrow," Jonathan said into my hair. "Tomorrow I'll start keeping detailed records, temperature, wood consumption, everything. If this works, I want proof. And if it doesn't, I want to know why, so someone else can learn from my failure." "You won't fail. You can't know that." "No. But I can believe it. And sometimes belief is the only thing strong enough to carry you through until knowledge arrives." We stood there holding each other in our strange metal-wrapped cabin while the first real winter wind howled outside and our daughters slept warm and safe and unafraid. I thought about all the choices that had led to this moment. Jonathan's war, my mother's death, our separate broken pieces that had somehow fit together into something that might actually survive. December was waiting. Montana winter in all its brutal glory was waiting. The mockery, the doubt, the terrible cold that killed livestock, standing up, all of it was waiting just beyond these walls. But for tonight we were warm. We were together. We had tried something impossible, and I believed with everything I had left in me that impossible might just be enough. December 8th arrived with a high-pressure system that stalled over Alberta and turned the air to knives. I woke to Rebecca's cough and knew before checking the thermometer that something had shifted. The quality of cold had changed. This wasn't November's testing frost. This was winter announcing its true intentions. 18 below zero outside. Inside, with the fire banked from the night, 54 degrees. Jonathan was already up adding wood to the firebox, moving quietly so as not to wake the girls. I watched him work from the bed, saw how carefully he fed the flames, how he studied the draft. He'd started keeping a log the week before, recording temperatures and wood consumption with the precision of an engineer documenting an experiment. Because that's what this was, an experiment with our lives as the test subjects. "How much wood did we use last night?" I asked. 3 pieces, same as the night before. He showed me the numbers in his notebook. In our old configuration, we'd been burning through half a cord every 4 days just to keep the cabin above freezing. Now we were on track to use maybe a cord and a half per month. The difference was measurable, undeniable, terrifying in its implications because it meant the thing everyone thought was madness was actually working. Rebecca's breathing sounded better. I pressed my hand to her forehead, found it cool. She stirred, opened her eyes. "Mama, I'm not cold." Such simple words. But I had to turn away so she wouldn't see me cry. The temperature dropped 2 degrees every day that week. 12 below, 15, 22. Reports from the trading post said families were already burning through their wood supplies faster than expected. Stephen Taylor's mill was running 16 hours a day, cutting anything with a trunk, selling green unseasoned pine that gave half the heat and twice the smoke. Laura Clark came by on December 11th leading her horse because the trail was too icy to ride. She looked haggard, older than her 29 years. Inside our cabin, she stopped, stared at the thermometer reading 58 degrees, then looked at me with something between confusion and desperation. "How is it this warm, Kate? Our cabin we're burning constantly and we can barely keep it above 42. I showed her the air gap, explained the principle as simply as I could. The metal stops the wind before it touches our walls. The airspace can't form the currents that strip heat away. It's like wearing 2 coats instead of 1. Can we build this too? Gary's talking about it. But the cost, the work. Jonathan can help design it. You don't need a Quonset hut, just a second wall with proper spacing." She gripped my hands. "The boys are so cold, Kate. They cry at night. We pile every blanket we own on them, and they still shake." Something in her voice made my stomach clench, an edge of panic that went beyond normal hardship, but she left before I could ask more, leading her horse back into cold that was already dropping toward -28. That night I heard wolves for the first time, not the distant howling I'd grown accustomed to, but close, circling. The sound made every primitive instinct in my body scream run. Nicole woke crying, asking if the monsters were coming. Jonathan went to the window, looked out into darkness cut only by starlight on snow. "They're hunting. The cold drives them down from the high country. They won't bother us." But his hand stayed on the rifle by the door. By December 15th, the temperature had hit -31. The trading post reported 3 deaths. An elderly couple in a cabin 12 miles north whose fire went out while they slept. A trapper who made it halfway home before hypothermia took him. The cold was killing with efficiency, sorting the prepared from the desperate, the lucky from the doomed. Gary Young rode past our place on the 16th, moving fast. I saw him through the window, hunched against wind that hit 40 miles per hour, his horse struggling through drifts. He didn't stop. Something about the set of his shoulders made me afraid. Jonathan went out to check the Quonset shell for damage, came back reporting everything secure. The metal sang in the wind, a high, keening note that vibrated through the air gap and into the cabin walls, but it held. Not a single panel had torn loose. Not a single rib had buckled. "We're using 4 pieces of wood per day." Now he told me that evening, updating his log. "At this rate, we'll make it through March with wood to spare." "Don't say that yet. Don't tempt it." "I'm not tempting anything, Kate. I'm documenting. Facts don't care about superstition." But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were somehow stealing this warmth, that the universe would notice and demand payment. My mother's voice in my head, the warnings she used to give about pride before falls, about counting chickens, about how winter always found the weak point. December 18th brought the coldest morning yet. -38 degrees when I checked at dawn. Wind chill somewhere below -60. The kind of cold that could kill exposed skin in minutes, that made breathing painful, that turned the world into a landscape designed for death. I made breakfast while Jonathan checked the fire, added another log even though we didn't strictly need it. Rebecca and Nicole sat at the table in their normal clothes, not coats, arguing about whose turn it was to help wash dishes. The thermometer read 61 degrees. Through the window I could see our breath frosting instantly in the air gap corridor when Jonathan opened the inner door to check the vents. But inside the cabin itself, we lived in relative comfort that felt obscene given what I knew was happening to our neighbors. The wolves came closer that night. I counted 5 distinct howls, each one nearer than the last. They were hunting in a pack, driven by hunger that made them bold. Jonathan sat by the window with the rifle across his knees while the girls slept, and I pretended to read by lamplight. They killed something around midnight. The sounds carried clearly through the metal shell, snarling, tearing the high scream of prey, then silence that somehow felt worse. "Do you think they'd try the cabin?" I asked. "No. The smell of smoke keeps them off. But they're desperate. Everything's desperate in cold like this." The next morning, Laura Clark appeared at our door on foot, no horse stumbling through drifts with her skirts frozen stiff. Her face was raw from windburn, her eyes red but dry in the way that meant she was past tears. I pulled her inside, wrapped her in blankets, made her sit by the fire, even though our cabin was already warm. She sat there shaking not from cold, but from something that had broken inside her. The boys. Her voice came out flat, emotionless, in shock. "Yesterday morning. They went out to the woodshed. Gary told them to be quick, just grab 2 logs each and come straight back. But the cold, it was so cold, and they were only 7, and something happened. Maybe they got turned around in the snow. Maybe they fell. We found them 20 feet from the cabin door. Frozen." I knelt in front of her, took her frozen hands in mine. "Laura." "Oh God, Laura." They were so close. 20 feet. If the cabin had been warmer, if they'd been able to feel where home was, maybe they would have made it. But everything was white and cold, and they got confused, and they were so small. She finally looked at me then, and what I saw in her eyes would haunt me for years. It wasn't just grief. It was the terrible knowledge that she had survived while her children hadn't, that 20 feet had been the difference between their lives and deaths, that if their cabin had just been warmer, if the cold hadn't been so disorienting, if, "You're warm here." She looked around our cabin at Rebecca and Nicole watching from the corner, alive and healthy. "How are you so warm?" I explained it again, but the words felt like ash in my mouth. We had warmth, while her boys froze 20 feet from safety. We had living daughters, while hers were dead. Jonathan's design worked perfectly, and that perfection was somehow the cruelest thing I could imagine in that moment. "Can Gary build this? Can you help him?" "I can't, Kate. I can't go through another winter like this. I can't lose anything else. Jonathan will help. We'll do whatever we can." She left an hour later, walking back to a cabin that would never be warm enough, to a husband broken by grief, to a life that had been cut in half by 20 feet of confusion in a blizzard. After she was gone, I held my daughters and cried. Rebecca asked why Mrs. Clark's boys had died. Nicole asked if we were safe. I told them yes, we were safe. But the yes felt like a lie, because safety was just a temporary condition, a trick of engineering and luck that could fail at any moment for reasons no one could predict. That night, Jonathan didn't sleep at all. I found him at dawn in the air gap corridor, sitting with his back against the cabin wall, his notebook open on his knees. He'd been calculating running numbers, trying to figure out if there was a way to retrofit Gary's cabin faster, cheaper, better. I could have shared the design earlier. His voice was raw. If I'd been less worried about being mocked, if I'd pushed harder to get people to try it. You couldn't have known. No one could have predicted this cold. But I knew the principle worked. I knew it from the Aleutians. I could have been louder about it. And they would have mocked you louder. You know they would have. Men like Stephen Taylor don't listen until they're forced to. He looked up at me with eyes that hadn't seen sleep. "Those boys died, Kate. 20 feet from safety, I know. But that's not your fault, and you can't save everyone. But maybe we can help Gary and Laura now. Maybe that's enough. It has to be." December 20th brought Stephen Taylor to our door. I heard his horse outside, heard him dismount and approach with the heavy tread of a large man. Jonathan tensed beside me, but I opened the door before he could. Stephen stood on the threshold, his face raw from cold ice in his beard. Behind him, the world was white and brutal temperature, somewhere around -35. He was dressed in layers so thick he could barely move, but still he shivered. "I saw Jonathan out yesterday, chopping wood in his shirt sleeves." The words came out accusing, suspicious, like he'd caught Jonathan in a crime. I stepped back, let him enter the airlock, then the cabin itself. The warmth hit him like a wall. I watched his expression change as the heat registered. Confusion first, then disbelief. He pulled off his gloves, with shaking hands touched his face like he couldn't trust what he was feeling. "How warm is it in here?" Jonathan showed him the thermometer. 63 degrees. Stephen stared at the mercury for a full minute. Then he walked to the north wall, the one farthest from the stove, pressed his palm flat against the logs. Still checking, still not believing. The coldest spot in the cabin read 58 degrees. The warmest near the firebox pushed 68. "This is impossible. It's physics, Stephen." Jonathan's voice was carefully neutral. "The metal shell blocks wind before it reaches the cabin walls. The air gap prevents convective heat loss. It's the same principle as double-pane windows, just scaled up. How much wood are you burning?" "About 3/4 of a cord every 2 weeks. Stephen's face went pale. 3/4. He was delivering that much to families every 4 days, and they were still freezing. I'm burning through a quart and a half per week at my own place. Can barely keep it above 47 degrees. Rebecca and Nicole came out from their bedroom, then dressed in cotton skirts and light sweaters, their feet bare on the floor. Normal clothing for normal temperature. Stephen watched them like they were creatures from another world. You're girls. They're not wearing coats. They don't need to. It's warm enough. He turned to me, and something in his expression had shifted from suspicion to something raw. You knew this would work, Kate. When everyone was laughing when I called it a tin coffin, you knew. I didn't know. I believed. There's a difference. Then you're braver than any of us. He looked back at Jonathan. I was wrong. Completely, utterly, catastrophically wrong. And because I was wrong, and because I was loud about being wrong, other men didn't even try this. They listened to me instead of thinking for themselves. You couldn't have known I offered. I should have kept my mouth shut. Let a man build what he wants without mocking it. He walked to the door, then turned back. Jonathan, I need to know how this works. Every detail. Because if I'm going to spend the rest of my life knowing I talked people out of survival, the least I can do is make sure that doesn't happen again. Jonathan spent the next hour showing Stephen everything. The air gap dimensions, the ventilation placement, the double-door airlock, the chimney collar. Stephen took notes like a student asking questions without ego, admitting ignorance without shame. It was the kind of humility that only comes from being absolutely provably wrong about something that mattered. Before he left, Stephen stopped at the door where I was standing. You believed in him when no one did, didn't you? I believed in us. And I was terrified I was wrong. But you weren't. And that took more courage than building the cabin. It took courage to watch everyone laugh and still choose faith. He rode away through cold that could kill him if his horse stumbled, if he lost the trail, if any of 100 small things went wrong. But he rode toward his sawmill and the families who depended on him, carrying knowledge that might save them. The word spread like fire in dry timber. By December 23rd, Donald Thomas arrived with his county extension office thermometer, the calibrated kind used for official weather records. He'd warned Jonathan months ago that the system would fail, that condensation would destroy the cabin, that the Quonset shell would collapse under snow load. Now he stood in our cabin with his instrument and measured. Outside temperature -35 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside temperature north wall 58 degrees. Inside temperature center, room 64 degrees. Inside temperature near stove 68 degrees. Average 63 degrees. Difference from exterior 98 degrees. He wrote it all in his official log, his handwriting precise and damning. Then he looked at Jonathan with an expression I'd seen on my students' faces when they finally understood a concept that had eluded them. Mr. Wright, I owe you an apology, and this valley owes you their lives. I'm publishing a bulletin next week recommending your method for any homesteader in exposed locations. You don't need to apologize. Yes, I do. I spoke with certainty about something I didn't understand. That's the worst kind of ignorance, the kind that sounds like expertise. He closed his log. How many lives might have been saved if I'd said, I don't know, let's see, instead of, this will fail. You couldn't have known. That's exactly my point, Mr. Wright. I couldn't have known. So I should have stayed silent and let the experiment speak. Instead I spoke and potentially killed by proxy. He left with his data driving his wagon toward Kalispell through a landscape that was actively trying to murder anything warm-blooded. But he left as an ally, a convert, someone who would spend the rest of his career making sure innovation didn't die under the weight of conventional wisdom. The visitors came in a steady stream after that. Neighbors who'd mocked us, builders who'd called it madness, families who were desperate and out of options. Jonathan showed them all the same things he'd shown Stephen. I explained the principles in the simplest terms I could manage, using metaphors about coats and blankets, and how stillness was its own kind of insulation. Gary Young came on December 27th, gaunt with grief, his eyes empty of everything except practical need. Laura stayed home. She couldn't face our warm cabin, our living daughters, the evidence that the right design could have saved her boys. Can you help me build something like this? Gary asked. I can't afford a Quonset hut. But lumber, I can manage lumber. Jonathan spread paper on our table, started sketching. You don't need the Quonset. The principle is what matters. Build a second wall around your existing cabin, leave a 16-inch air gap, minimum. Ensure proper ventilation, top and bottom. Use whatever materials you have. How long will it take? Working alone, maybe 2 weeks. With help, 1. I'll help. I sat down at the table. Laura and I can handle the lighter work while you and Gary do the structural pieces. Gary looked at me with something that might have been gratitude if he'd had any emotion left to spare. Why would you help us, Kate? After what happened. After we doubted you. Because that's what neighbors do. And because those boys deserved better than they got from this winter. We started work on Gary's cabin on December 29th. The temperature had moderated slightly up to -15, which felt almost balmy after the previous week. Jonathan designed a simple frame system using 2x4 studs set 16 inches out from Gary's existing walls with horizontal cross-bracing every 4 feet for stability. We used rough-cut lumber from Stephen's mill sold at cost because Stephen was trying to atone. Laura worked beside me, silent but steady. We measured cut-handed materials till the men kept the work moving. She didn't talk about her boys, didn't talk about anything. Just worked like labor was the only thing keeping her upright. On the third day, while the men were on the roof adjusting ventilation, Laura finally spoke. Do you ever feel guilty, Kate, that you're warm while others freeze? Every day, every single day. But you still stay warm. Yes. Because survival isn't something to be ashamed of. And because maybe by staying warm, by showing others it's possible, we make more survival possible. She nodded back to hammering. But an hour later she said, the boys would have loved your girls' dresses, the way they wear them inside like it's summer. They still can, Laura. When this is done, when your cabin is warm, you can have more children who wear summer clothes in winter. I don't know if I can do that again. Risk loving something that much. You can. You will. Because the alternative is letting winter win everything, and you're stronger than that. I didn't know if that was true, but I said it with enough conviction that maybe saying it could make it true. Gary's cabin modification was finished on January 10th. We'd added a complete second wall around the northwest and south exposures, the directions that took the worst wind. The east wall backed up against a rock face that provided natural wind protection, so we left it alone. Total cost $48 in lumber and materials. Total time 12 days of hard labor. The first night in their modified cabin, Gary and Laura burned their usual amount of wood and watched the temperature climb to 56 degrees. Not as warm as ours, but 20 degrees warmer than they'd managed all winter. Enough that they could sleep without coats. Enough that children, if they had them again, could survive. Gary sent word, through Stephen, fuel consumption dropped 42% immediately. Temperature gains averaged 15 degrees across all conditions. The system worked even in its simplified form. By mid-January, 7 families in the valley had purchased Quonset huts from the Great Falls Depot. 5 more were building double-wall modifications using Gary's cabin as a template. Donald Thomas published his bulletin in the County Extension newsletter, complete with temperature data and construction diagrams. He called it the Wright thermal envelope method, which made Jonathan wince because he'd never wanted his name attached, had never wanted recognition, just results. But recognition came anyway. Men rode from as far as Idaho and Wyoming to see the cabin, to measure the air gap, to understand how something so simple could make such a dramatic difference. I became an unexpected teacher, explaining principles to wives and mothers who needed to understand not just that it worked, but why it worked, so they could convince their husbands to try. One woman, Patricia, from a homestead near the Wyoming border, asked me how I'd found the courage to let Jonathan build something everyone thought was crazy. I was more scared of staying the same than I was of trying something new. And I trusted him. Not because I knew he was right, but because I knew he needed to try and I needed to let him. That's love, she said. No. Love is easy when someone's succeeding. This was faith. Faith is harder. She built a double wall system with her husband that spring. Sent word the next winter that it had saved them. The transformation I felt in myself during those weeks was subtle but profound. I'd spent my whole adult life defining myself in relation to fear. Afraid of isolation because of my mother. Afraid of cold because of how she died. afraid of risk because safety seemed like the only intelligent choice. But here in the coldest winter in Montana history, I'd learned that safety and survival weren't the same thing. Safety was an illusion, a trick we played on ourselves to feel in control. Survival was active, demanding, required faith in things that hadn't been proven yet. One night in late January, after the girls were asleep and Jonathan was updating his meticulous logs, I sat at our table and thought about the woman I'd been in Chicago. The teacher who took the same streetcar every day, who dated a banker because he represented stability, who planned her life around avoiding risk. That woman wouldn't recognize Montana Katherine. I'd become someone who could explain thermodynamics to skeptical farmers, someone who could swing a hammer for 12 hours helping Gary build his walls, someone who could watch her daughters thrive in cotton dresses in the middle of winter and not feel guilty about it, just grateful. Jonathan looked up from his notebook. "What are you thinking about?" "About how I used to be afraid of empty places, about how I thought my mother died because she was alone in the wilderness. But she didn't die because of where she was. She died because no one had figured out how to keep cabins warm enough. It wasn't the wilderness that killed her. It was engineering that hadn't advanced far enough yet." He set down his pen. "You've changed, Kate. Since we came here, so have you. You don't wake up screaming as much. The work helps. Having something to protect, something to build. It gives the broken pieces something to do besides just rattle around." I reached across the table, took his hand. "We healed each other, didn't we? You gave me purpose, I gave you faith, and together we made something that works." "The cabin, you mean?" "No. Us. The cabin is just proof." February brought Andrew back to our door. He arrived without warning, just like before, but this time he didn't stand in judgment. He knocked, waited, entered with a humility that looked foreign on his proud features. Jonathan was out checking the vents. Andrew stood in our warm cabin and stared at the thermometer reading 62 degrees, while outside hovered near -10. "I was wrong," he said to me, not waiting for Jonathan. "So utterly, completely, dangerously wrong. You didn't know. I should have trusted him. He's my brother. He survived Normandy, built 6 cabins before France. And I dismissed him because he came back different, because I thought broken meant useless." He sat down at our table uninvited. Rebecca and Nicole watched from their bedroom doorway, uncertain about this uncle who'd called their father incompetent. "I kept records this winter, Katherine. My cabin in Whitefish, the one that won the county fair, the one I was so proud of. 1.8 cords of wood per month, average temperature 47 degrees. Jonathan's cabin, the one I called desperate. 0.7 cords per month, average temperature 63 degrees. He looked at me with something that might have been shame or might have been awe. A 16-degree difference. Do you know what 16 degrees means in terms of human comfort and survival? It means my daughters don't sleep in coats. It means your daughters live instead of dying. Like the young boys, like 6 others this winter who might have made it if their cabins had been warmer." Jonathan came in then, snow on his shoulders, and stopped when he saw his brother. Andrew stood. "I called you broken, said you couldn't engineer your way out of trauma. I was wrong on both counts. You did engineer your way out, and it saved more than just you." Jonathan's face was carefully blank the way it got when he was fighting emotion. "Forgive me, little brother." Andrew's voice cracked. "Please." Jonathan crossed the room, pulled his brother into an embrace that looked like it hurt both of them. "Nothing to forgive. You were protecting me the only way you knew how." "No. You were protecting them. I should have seen it, should have helped instead of mocked." They stood there holding each other while I shepherded the girls back to their room to give the men privacy. Through the door I heard Andrew's voice thick with tears. "I'm proud of you, Jonathan. Prouder than I've ever been of anyone." And Jonathan's response so quiet I almost missed it. "I just wanted to keep them safe. That's all I ever wanted." Later, after Andrew left, promising to build double walls on his own cabin and recommend the method to his clients, I found Jonathan in the air gap corridor. He was sitting in his old spot back against the cabin wall, but this time his journal was closed beside him. "You did it." I sat down next to him. "You proved everyone wrong. I proved physics right. That's different. Don't minimize this. You saw something no one else saw. You fought for it when everyone mocked you. You built it anyway. That's courage, Jonathan. That's strength." He turned to look at me, and in the dim light filtering through the vents, I saw him clearly for the first time in months. The hollowness around his eyes had eased. The constant tension in his shoulders had softened. He looked less like a man running from demons and more like a man who'd outrun them. "I couldn't have done this without you, Kate. When Andrew mocked me, when Stephen laughed, when everyone thought I was crazy. You stayed. You believed. I was terrified I was wrong. But you stayed anyway. That's the thing that saved me. Not the cabin. You." I leaned against him, felt his arm come around me. Through the metal shell we could hear wind, but it was distant now, deflected, impotent against the engineering that had beaten it. We saved each other, and that's how it works. That's how survival works. Not alone. Together. By the time the deep cold finally broke in mid-February, temperatures moderating to a merely brutal 10 below the transformation of Flathead Valley was visible and measurable. 19 cabins within a 50-mile radius had implemented some version of double-wall construction. Deaths from exposure dropped to 0 for the remainder of the winter. Wood consumption across the valley fell by an estimated 35%. The numbers mattered, but what mattered more was what I saw when Laura Clark came to visit in late February. She'd brought bread she'd baked in her now warm cabin, and she stayed for coffee, and she laughed. Actually laughed at something Rebecca said about a snowman. It was the first time I'd heard her laugh since her boys died. "We're going to try again," she told me quietly while the girls played. "For children, Gary and I. We're terrified. But the cabin is warm now. It's not a guarantee, but it's a chance. That's all any of us have. Chances. And the courage to take them." She gripped my hand. "You and Jonathan. You didn't just build a cabin. You built hope. You showed us that maybe we're not just at winter's mercy. Maybe we can fight back." After she left, I stood at our window watching the sun set over mountains that had seemed like enemies when we'd arrived and now just looked like geography. Neutral. Neither friend nor foe. Just the place where we'd chosen to live and learned to survive and maybe even started to thrive. Rebecca's asthma had all but disappeared. She'd had one mild attack in January, resolved quickly in warm air. The doctor in Kalispell, when we'd taken her in for a checkup, had been amazed by the improvement. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it," he'd said. "Her lungs are clearer than I've ever seen them." "We're staying warm," I'd told him. "That's all. Just staying warm." Nicole had grown half an inch since November, was eating better, sleeping through the night without the coughing that had plagued her in our first winter. Both girls had color in their cheeks, energy, the resilience of children who weren't spending all their resources just trying to stay alive. Jonathan's journal for February showed consumption of 0.6 cords of wood, average temperature 61 degrees, 0 condensation issues, 0 structural problems with the Quonset shell. The metal had held against snow loads that collapsed 2 barns in the valley. The ventilation had prevented every moisture problem Donald Thomas had predicted. On February 28th, the last day of the month, Jonathan closed his journal and set it aside. "I think we made it, Kate. I think we actually survived." I pulled him close, pressed my face against his chest, felt his heartbeat steady and strong. We did more than survive. We proved that broken people can build things that protect. That fear doesn't have to win. That sometimes the craziest-looking solution is the right one. The story wasn't over. Spring would come, and with it more families wanting to replicate what we'd done. Summer would bring construction refinements, improvements. Next winter would test the second generation of double-wall cabins. But standing there in our warm cabin with our healthy daughters and my healed husband, I knew the hardest part was behind us. We'd faced the worst Montana could throw at us, and we'd won. Not through stubbornness or luck, but through engineering and faith and the kind of partnership that made impossible things possible. Outside, the wind still blew. Inside, we were warm. And that made all the difference. Spring arrived in Montana with the abruptness of a curtain being pulled back. One day we were still burning wood against the lingering March cold, and the next, the snow was retreating up the mountainsides and the creek behind our cabin was roaring with meltwater. The Quonset shell, which had sung with wind all winter, now drummed with rain and dripped with snowmelt that Jonathan caught in barrels for summer use. The transformation of the valley became visible once the snow cleared. Gary Young's cabin with its rough lumber second wall. The Morrison place with a pole barn extension creating a partial envelope. 3 homesteads to the north with full Quonset installations that gleamed in the strengthening sun like badges of survival. By April, Jonathan and I had visitors nearly every week. Men with notebooks and measuring tapes asking about air gap dimensions and ventilation ratios. Women wanting to understand the principles well enough to explain them to skeptical husbands. I found myself standing in our cabin or in the air gap corridor teaching physics concepts I'd barely understood 6 months ago, using metaphors about blankets and coats and how stillness was its own kind of protection. A homesteader named Patricia Johnson arrived in late April from a claim near the Wyoming border, her wagon loaded with lumber and determination. She'd read Donald Thomas's bulletin and convinced her husband to try the double wall approach, but she wanted to see ours first to understand it with her own eyes before committing their resources. I walked her through everything while Jonathan was out checking fence lines damaged by winter. Patricia took notes in a careful hand, asked questions that showed she'd been thinking deeply about the engineering. How did you find the courage to let him build this when everyone said it was madness? The question stopped me because I'd asked myself variations of it 100 times. I was more terrified of staying the same than of trying something different. And I needed to believe that fear didn't have to make all my decisions. She looked at me with eyes that had seen hard winters. That's not about cabins at all, is it? No. It's about learning to trust your partner when the whole world is saying they're wrong. It's about discovering you're braver than you thought. Patricia built her double wall that summer. She sent a letter the following January reporting that their cabin stayed comfortable through cold that had nearly killed them the year before. At the bottom, she'd added a line in different ink like she'd come back to it later. You didn't just teach me about building, you taught me about faith. Donald Thomas's bulletin went out through the County Extension Service in March, a technical document dense with temperature data and construction specifications. He'd titled it, Wright Thermal Envelope Method Documented Performance in Extreme Conditions, and included Jonathan's meticulous logs from the entire winter. Average interior temperature 62.3 degrees. Average exterior temperature minus 11.7. Wood consumption 0.75 cords per month. Lives saved uncountable. The bulletin spread beyond Montana faster than I'd expected. Extension agents in Idaho picked it up, then Wyoming, then as far as Alaska, where military surplus Quonset huts were plentiful and cold was a way of life. Jonathan started receiving letters asking for clarification on ventilation placement on optimal air gap width for different climate zones, on whether the method worked with materials other than Quonset steel. He answered every letter. Sat at our table in the evenings with Rebecca and Nicole doing homework beside him, writing out explanations in his precise engineer's hand. He never charged for consultations, never tried to patent the design. When I asked him why, he just shook his head. This isn't mine to own, Kate. It's physics. I just applied it. Anyone who needs warmth has a right to know how. By summer of 1948, 12 families in the valley had implemented some version of the system. Stephen Taylor, whose mockery had almost broken Jonathan's resolve, became one of the method's strongest advocates. His sawmill sold lumber at cost to families building double walls, and he personally helped construct 4 installations, learning the principles well enough to teach others. He stopped by one evening in June, brought venison steaks and an apology he'd already made but apparently needed to make again. I keep thinking about the young boys. How if I'd kept my mouth shut instead of calling your design a tin coffin, maybe Gary would have tried it sooner. Jonathan was quiet for a moment. You can't carry that, Stephen. You didn't kill those children. The cold did. And now you're helping make sure it doesn't happen again. That's what matters. But Stephen's face said he'd carry it anyway, the way we all carried the weight of the choices we made and the consequences that rippled out from them. Laura Clark came by more frequently that spring and summer, often bringing preserves or bread, always staying to talk with me while the men discussed construction with Jonathan. She was pregnant again, showing by July terrified and hopeful in equal measure. What if I can't do it, Kate? What if I can't love another child after losing the boys? You will. Because love isn't something you run out of. It's something that grows to fill whatever space you give it. But what if something happens? What if this winter? Your cabin is warm now. You have a chance. That's more than you had before. She gripped my hands, her belly round between us. Promise me something. If I can't do this, if the grief is too much and I fail this baby somehow, you'll tell them I tried. You won't fail Laura. You're stronger than winter. You've already proved it. The baby came in December of 1948, a girl they named Sarah. I was there for the birth, helped Laura through the pain in a cabin that stayed 60 degrees even on the coldest day. The baby was healthy, loud, perfect. Laura cried when she held her, but this time the tears were something other than grief. The boys would have loved her. She looked at me over the baby's head. They would have been good brothers. They still are, just from somewhere else now. I became something I'd never expected in those years, a teacher again, but of a subject I'd never studied in any school. Women came to me wanting to understand not just how the double walls worked, but why their husbands should build them, what objections to counter, how to make the case that investing time and money in something unconventional was worth the risk. I developed a way of explaining it that bypassed technical language entirely. Imagine your cabin is you and winter is everyone who ever doubted you. You can stand there and let the doubters wear you down, or you can build a shield that keeps them far enough away that their voices can't hurt you. That's what the second wall does. It keeps the hurt far enough away that you can survive it. One woman, an older homesteader named Shirley, looked at me sharply after I said that. "You're not talking about cabins anymore, are you, Katherine?" "I'm always talking about cabins, but also about everything else." By the winter of 1948 to 49, 19 cabins in the valley had double-wall systems in varying configurations. Death rates from cold exposure dropped to 0 for the first time in recorded county history. Wood consumption fell by an average of 38%. Families that had struggled to survive previous winters now had enough fuel left over to share with newcomers or sell for extra income. The transformation wasn't just physical. Something had shifted in how people approached problems. I saw it in the way men gathered at the trading post, no longer just complaining about conditions, but discussing solutions. In the way women shared knowledge instead of hoarding it. In the way the valley felt less like a collection of isolated homesteads and more like a community that had learned survival was a collective endeavor. Rebecca turned 10 in 1949, and I watched her watching her father work. She asked questions about why the air gap needed to be exactly 24 inches, about how heat moved through different materials, about whether the principle could work on smaller structures like chicken coops or root cellars. Jonathan answered with the seriousness he'd give another engineer, drawing diagrams showing her his calculation methods. One evening she announced at dinner that she wanted to study engineering when she grew up. "Not teaching like me?" I asked, only half joking. "You're teaching Mama, just different things. But I want to learn how to build things that protect people, like Daddy does." Nicole, 8 now, and increasingly interested in how things looked rather than how they worked, studied the cabin drawings Jonathan had pinned to the wall. "I want to make buildings that are beautiful and warm. Is that possible?" "That's called architecture, sweetheart. And yes, it's absolutely possible." I thought about my daughters growing up in this cabin, learning lessons about resilience and innovation, and the difference between conventional wisdom and actual wisdom. They would leave Montana someday, I was certain of that. But they would leave carrying knowledge that came from watching their father prove everyone wrong and their mother choose faith over fear. The winter of 1949 to 50 was milder, almost a disappointment after the brutal preceding year. Temperature bottomed out at -22, and families with double-wall systems barely noticed it. Our own cabin stayed so consistently warm that I sometimes forgot it was winter at all. Rebecca and Nicole did their schoolwork at the table in cotton dresses, played on the floor without extra layers, lived as if the calendar said April instead of January. Jonathan's nightmares had become rare by then, maybe once or twice a month instead of nightly. The hollowness that had haunted his eyes since France had filled in with something that looked like peace. He still worked obsessively, but now it was on refinements and helping others rather than proving his own worth. One night in March of 1950, I found him in the air gap corridor, not sitting this time, but standing with his palm pressed against the cabin wall. "What are you doing?" "Feeling it breathe. The cabin. It expands and contracts with temperature just slightly. I never noticed before because I was always so focused on whether it was working. But it's alive in its way. You sound like a poet. Engineers are just poets who use numbers instead of words." He turned to me in the dim light filtering from the cabin. "I'm better, Kate. I can feel it. The war, it's not gone. But it's not drowning me anymore. The cabin saved you." "No. You did. The cabin was just the tool you used." By 1951, the Wright method had spread beyond Montana. We received letters from homesteaders in Alaska who'd used military surplus to create thermal envelopes that made subsistence living possible in conditions that had previously been barely survivable. A mining operation in northern Idaho implemented the principle in their bunkhouses and reported fuel savings that paid for the construction in a single season. A mission in Wyoming built a school using double-wall design and could finally hold classes through winter without children losing fingers to frostbite. Jonathan kept every letter in a box under our bed. Sometimes I'd find him reading them, his finger tracing the words where someone thanked him for saving their family or making their lives bearable. He never responded to the thanks directly, just to technical questions. But I knew the gratitude mattered to him in a way he couldn't articulate. Rebecca was 14 in 1953 when she asked to accompany her father on a consultation trip to help a family near the Idaho border retrofit their cabin. She came back sunburned and happy, talking nonstop about load calculations and wind resistance and how the family's children had reminded her of herself and Nicole when they were younger. "I'm going to do this someday, Mama. Help people build things that work, things that save lives. You already are, sweetheart. You helped that family today." "No, I mean really. Like a job. Like what I'll be when I grow up." I looked at my daughter, nearly as tall as me now, with her father's precise way of thinking, and my determination to use knowledge as a weapon against suffering. "You'll be wonderful at it." Nicole, at 12, was designing elaborate floor plans for imaginary houses, drawing them with careful attention to window placement and room flow and how light would move through the spaces. She showed me one evening a sketch of a cabin with curved walls and enormous windows facing south. "Would this work, Mama? Could you keep it warm?" "I don't know, baby. That's a question for an architect and an engineer working together. Like me and Rebecca someday. Exactly like you and Rebecca someday." The years from 1950 to 1955 passed with the strange acceleration that comes when life is good and stable. Seasons turned, crops grew. Jonathan refined his designs and consulted on installations across 3 states. I taught intermittently at the small school that had opened in a homesteader's barn 8 miles north, giving the valley children something approaching formal education. We became part of the community's fabric in a way I'd never imagined possible during those first frozen years. Jonathan served on the volunteer fire brigade. I organized a lending library from our own books and donations from families moving away. Rebecca and Nicole made friends, attended socials, lived the kind of frontier childhood that would have been impossible if we'd stayed in Chicago. But underneath the contentment, I felt time moving like water toward an inevitable falls. The girls were growing. They would need more than Montana could give them. Rebecca talked increasingly about engineering programs at universities. Nicole collected architecture magazines from mail-order catalogs and studied photographs of buildings in cities we'd never seen. One night in 1956, after the girls were asleep, Jonathan spread a map on our table. Montana State University in Bozeman, University of Wyoming in Laramie, schools with programs that could turn our daughters into the professionals they wanted to become. "They'll leave us." My voice came out smaller than I intended. "Yes, but we built them strong enough to leave. That was always the point." "I know. It just feels like we fought so hard to create this home and now it's going to empty out." "Homes aren't meant to hold people prisoner, Kate. They're meant to be foundations people launch from." Rebecca left for Montana State in the fall of 1959. She was 20 older than most freshmen because we'd wanted her to be absolutely certain to have saved enough from summer work helping Jonathan with consultations to be ready for the shift from frontier homestead to university campus. We drove her to Bozeman in September, helped her move into a dormitory that felt both foreign and strangely familiar, like coming home to a place I'd left 20 years before. The night before we left, Rebecca took my hands in hers. "Thank you for showing me that believing in impossible things isn't stupid. It's how you change the world." I drove home with Jonathan in silence, broken only by the sound of tires on gravel and my occasional tears that I wiped away before he could see. The cabin felt enormous and empty with just the three of us. Nicole left 2 years later in 1961, heading to the University of Wyoming with a portfolio of drawings and a scholarship based on an essay she'd written about how her father's Quonset cabin had taught her that function and beauty weren't opposites, but partners. She was 19, confident in a way I'd never been at that age, ready to take on a world that had already decided she was too young and too female to be an architect, but hadn't reckoned with her particular brand of Wright stubbornness. After she left, Jonathan and I rattled around the cabin like two people who'd forgotten how to be just a couple instead of parents. We were 49 and 47, no longer young but not quite old, facing the question of what came next when the thing you'd built your life around had served its purpose and moved on. It was Jonathan who suggested we leave. We'd been sitting at dinner on a November evening in 1962, the cabin warm around us, but feeling somehow hollow. He'd been quiet all day, which usually meant he was working through something complex. The girls are both in school. They're doing well, they're safe, they're building their own lives, and they're both in places we can reach easier from Kalispell than from here. You want to move to town? I think maybe it's time. We proved what we needed to prove. The cabin works. The method is established. And I'm tired, Kate. Tired of hauling water and chopping wood and fighting distance every time we want to see our daughters or buy supplies or just exist in the world beyond these walls. I looked around the cabin that had saved us, that had proven Jonathan Wright and me faithful, that had taught our daughters what was possible when you refuse to accept conventional limitations. The thought of leaving felt like betrayal and relief in equal measure. What would we do in Kalispell? Live. Just live. Without having to survive every single day. Maybe I could consult more easily. Maybe you could teach at the real school. Maybe we could be people instead of just homesteaders. I'm scared. The admission came out before I could stop it. This cabin, it's where we figured everything out. Where we became who we are. What if we leave and lose that? We won't. Because who we are isn't tied to these walls, Kate. It's in us. In what we built together that has nothing to do with logs and steel. We decided that night to move the following spring. Spent the winter gradually packing, sorting through 15 years of accumulated life, deciding what to take and what to leave. The cabin would stay standing, Jonathan insisted. Someone might need it someday, or it could serve as an example, or simply remain as proof that the thing had been built and had worked. My final walk through the cabin happened on a May morning in 1962, the day before the movers would come to take our furniture to the house we'd bought in Kalispell. Jonathan was outside loading boxes. I moved through the rooms alone, touching walls that no longer grew frost, standing in the air. Gap corridor one last time, remembering what it had felt like to think my husband was insane and choose to believe in him anyway. In the corridor I found Jonathan's old journal, the one from the first winter tucked behind a support post where he'd apparently hidden it years ago and forgotten. I opened it to a page marked with a dried aspen leaf. The entry was dated March 1948. Kate believed when no one did, not even me sometimes. This cabin stands because she stood by me. If I've built anything worth remembering, it's not the walls. It's the faith she taught me to have in myself. I sat down right there in the dirt floor of the air gap, the journal in my lap, and cried. Not from sadness, but from the weight of recognition. We'd both been broken when we came here. The cabin hadn't fixed us. We'd fixed each other, and the cabin had been the proof. Jonathan found me there an hour later. He sat down beside me without speaking, and we stayed there in the corridor between inside and outside, between protection and exposure, between what we'd been and what we'd become. I found your journal. I showed him the page. I meant for you to find it. Someday. I guess someday is now. Why didn't you just tell me? Because some things are too big to say out loud. They need to be written so they can be found when the finding matters most. We walked out of the cabin together that afternoon, locked the door with a key we left with Gary and Laura, and drove away from the place that had shaped us into people who could survive anything. The years in Kalispell were different, easier in most ways, but missing something essential that took me time to identify. We lived in a real house with running water and electric lights and neighbors close enough to hear through walls. Jonathan consulted on cold climate construction across the Northwest, traveling sometimes for weeks while I taught 4th grade at the elementary school and tried to remember how to live among people instead of beside them. Rebecca graduated from Montana State in 1963 with a degree in mechanical engineering and a job offer from an aerospace company in California working on thermal systems for spacecraft. When she told us, her voice was bright with excitement and shadowed with apology. "It's like what you built, Dad, just for different conditions. Extreme cold in space instead of Montana. The principles are the same." Jonathan hugged her hard. "You're going to do amazing things, sweetheart. Build systems that keep people safe. That's all that matters." Nicole graduated in 1965 with her architecture degree and immediately landed a position with a firm specializing in disaster relief housing. Her first project was designing temporary shelters for earthquake survivors that could maintain livable temperatures in extreme conditions using passive systems and double-wall construction. I'm using the cabin mama. Everything I learned watching Dad build it. I'm putting it into buildings that save people. That's the best legacy your father could have hoped for. By 1967, both girls were established professionals living far from Montana, visiting twice a year, calling monthly building lives that justified every risk Jonathan and I had taken to get them there. They were successful and happy, and so competently themselves that sometimes I forgot they'd ever been small enough to hold. Jonathan aged well. The lines that had come from war and worry gradually became lines of experience and satisfaction. He stopped waking from nightmares entirely around 1965, started sleeping through the night like a man who'd finally made peace with his memories. We were together 22 years when he turned 59 and told me he'd never expected to live this long, had certainly never expected to live this well. The cabin stood empty all those years, maintained by families in the valley who used it occasionally as shelter during storms, but mostly left it alone out of some unspoken reverence. It became a kind of landmark, a place extension agents brought visiting engineers and architects to show what was possible when you questioned assumptions. In 1970, a graduate student from the University of Idaho wrote her thesis on frontier innovation and interviewed me for 6 hours about the winter of 1947. She asked how I'd found the courage to support Jonathan's design when everyone thought it was madness. I gave her the same answer I'd given Patricia Johnson 22 years earlier. Fear doesn't have to be the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes you can choose to listen to faith instead. She published the thesis under the title Thermal Envelope Design on the Montana Frontier: How Desperation Became Innovation. Jonathan kept a copy on his desk until he died. I'm writing this now from a perspective most people never get old enough to see how the story ended, young enough to still remember how it felt in the middle. I'm 73. Jonathan died 2 years ago peacefully in his sleep, having lived long enough to see both our daughters successful and our grandchildren born into a world where keeping warm was a problem that had been mostly solved. But yesterday I received a letter that brought everything back into sharp focus. The envelope was postmarked from Alaska, addressed in careful handwriting to Katherine Wright, Kalispell, Montana. Inside was a 2-page letter from a woman named Emily Stevens explaining that she and her husband had built a cabin using the Wright method in a region so remote that the nearest town was 40 miles away. They had 3 children under 10. Last winter had been brutal, temperatures dropping to -50, but their cabin had stayed warm, their children had stayed healthy, and their family had survived. At the bottom of the 2nd page she'd written, "Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for showing us that questioning everyone doesn't make you crazy. It makes you a survivor. Our children are alive because 30 years ago you chose to believe in your husband when no one else would." I sat in my kitchen in Kalispell holding that letter and crying. Not from grief this time, though I grieved Jonathan every day, but from the sudden understanding of what we'd actually done. We hadn't just built a cabin. We'd created a legacy of survival that was still protecting families we'd never meet in places we'd never see. Jonathan would have loved this letter, would have filed it carefully in his box with all the others, would have written back with practical advice and gentle encouragement. Since he couldn't, I would. I pulled out my stationery and began to write. Dear Emily, thank you for your letter. I'm glad the method is keeping your family safe. If you have technical questions, I'm happy to help, though most of what I know I learned from watching my husband work. What I can tell you is this: the warmth you're feeling isn't just physical. It's the warmth that comes from knowing you fought for something and won. Hold on to that. Teach your children that impossible is just another word for not tried yet. And when winter comes and the wind howls, remember that every time you stay warm, you're proving that courage compounds. Your warmth makes the next family's warmth possible. That's how survival spreads. One cabin at a time, one choice to believe at a time. With admiration, Katherine Wright. I sealed the letter and walked it to the post office, then came home to the house Jonathan and I had shared for 13 years. It was warm, comfortable, thoroughly modern. But it wasn't the cabin. Would never be the cabin. That evening I called Rebecca in California. She answered on the third ring, sounding harried and happy, her children audible in the background. Mom, everything okay? Everything's fine, sweetheart. I just wanted to tell you something. You know how you're working on thermal systems for the Mars mission? The habitat module, yes. We're trying to create a double-layer insulation system that can handle extreme temperature differentials. That's your father's cabin. That's the Quonset shell scaled up for space. There was a pause. Then her voice came back thick with emotion. I know, Mom. I've been using his journals as reference. His calculations from 1947 still hold up. He was solving problems people didn't even know existed yet. He was just trying to keep his family warm. No. He was changing how people thought about protection. He just happened to use his family as the test case. After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my living room and thought about the trajectory from that frozen Montana cabin to a Mars habitat module, about how one desperate choice to try something impossible had rippled outward through decades and disciplines, and would keep rippling long after I was gone. Jonathan used to say that survival was just applied stubbornness with enough engineering to make it work. But I think it's bigger than that. Survival is choosing to believe that tomorrow can be different from today, and then building the tools to make that belief real. The cabin still stands. I drove out to see it last month, took my youngest grandchild, who's 8, and curious about everything. We walked through the air-gap corridor together, my hand on her shoulder, and I told her about the winter when everyone thought her great-grandfather was crazy, and I chose to think he was brilliant instead. Was he crazy, Grammy? A little. But also right. And sometimes those things aren't opposites. She ran her small hand along the cabin wall, feeling the solid spruce logs that had held against cold that could kill. Can we go inside? We went in. The cabin was dusty, but intact, still functional after 35 years. The thermometer was still on the wall, frozen at 62 degrees from whatever year someone had last lit the fire. The firebox stood empty, but ready. The whole space felt suspended, waiting like it could wake up any moment and remember its purpose. My grandchild sat at the table where her mother had done homework, where Jonathan had written his letters, where I'd chosen faith over fear 1,000 times in 1,000 small ways. This is where Mommy grew up, part of where she grew up. This is where she learned that being different isn't the same as being wrong. I wish I could have met Great-Grandpa Jonathan. He would have loved you, would have taught you to question everything and trust yourself and build things that protect people. Can I do that even though I'm a girl? Especially because you're a girl. Your great-grandmother proved that women can be just as stubborn and just as right as men. We just do it differently. We locked up the cabin and drove back to Kalispell as the sun set over mountains that still looked like neutral geography to me. Neither friend nor enemy. Just the place where we'd learned what we were made of. Last week I organized all of Jonathan's papers and journals, donated them to the Montana Historical Society, along with photographs, and the technical drawings from the original Quonset installation. The archivist who accepted them was a young man, probably 30, with enthusiasm that reminded me of Jonathan at that age. "This is significant historical material, Mrs. Wright. Your husband's work influenced cold climate construction across multiple states. He just wanted to keep his family warm. Everything else was accidental." The archivist smiled. "The best innovations usually are. I'm writing this final section on a September evening in 1978. I'm 73 years old, living alone in a comfortable house in Kalispell, watching the first snow of the season drift past my window. Tomorrow I'll wake up warm, a condition I once thought required constant sacrifice and now recognize as the dividend of choices made 30 years ago." Rebecca called this afternoon to tell me her Mars habitat design had been approved for the next phase of testing. Nicole called tonight to say her disaster housing project had just won a national award. Both my daughters are using the lessons they learned in that metal-wrapped cabin to protect people in conditions their father never imagined. And somewhere in Alaska, a family I'll never meet is staying warm because I chose to believe in an impossible thing. That's the real legacy. Not the cabin itself, but the principle it proved that questioning conventional wisdom isn't heresy. It's how progress happens. That fear is just one voice among many, and we get to choose which voice we amplify. That broken people can build unbreakable things if someone believes in them long enough. Jonathan and I didn't set out to change anything. We just wanted to survive. But survival, it turns out, is contagious. One family figures it out and shares it, and suddenly other families have the same chance. The warmth spreads not through grand gestures, but through quiet choices made in desperate times by ordinary people who refused to accept that freezing was inevitable. If I could go back to that November morning in 1947 and speak to the woman watching her husband drag a Quonset hut up a frozen trail, I would tell her this: trust him. Trust yourself. Trust that impossible things become possible the moment someone has the courage to try them and the stubbornness to keep trying when everyone laughs. But I can't go back. I can only go forward carrying the knowledge that every time I stayed when I wanted to run, every time I chose faith when fear seemed smarter, I was building something larger than warmth. I was proving that love and engineering aren't opposite forces, but complementary ones. That the strongest structures are built not just from steel and wood, but from belief and partnership, and the refusal to accept that winter always wins. The cabin stands empty now, but it's never been more full of the choices we made, the risks we took, the faith we sustained against every reasonable doubt, full of the legacy we created without meaning to, just by refusing to freeze. And that in the end is all any of us can hope to leave behind, proof that we were here, that we tried, that we turned our brokenness into something that protected others long after we were gone. Tomorrow more snow will fall, but tonight I'm warm, and that makes all the difference.